Wilhelmshaven Port, January 27, 1943. Narrated by Sasha Maggio. On 27 January 1943, just about 80 years ago, the U.S. Army Air Force conducted its first daytime bombing mission against the Nazi fatherland, targeting a port in northern Germany. The U.S. 8th Air Force was officially activated at the beginning of March 1942, and by September they were moved to England and set up at a base known as RAF Thurley. RAF Thurley has since closed, but several of the RAF bases still support our U.S. Air Force today. The longest continuously serving U.S. AAF group in World War II was the 306th Bombardment Group, which was part of the 8th Air Force. This is the unit that was sent on the Wilhelmshaven mission in January 1943. The 306th Bombardment Group, Heavy, was ready to make history with the first American daylight bombing raid, not just against the Axis forces in Europe, but against Axis forces and military assets inside Germany. Not only could we now reach Hitler's Germany, but we could reach it with American heavy bombers in broad daylight. Technology at this time was obviously significantly limited compared to what our aircraft use today. Much of the bombing missions conducted by the RAF were done at night, which potentially increased safety because it was harder to see the planes, but it did decrease precision. The American pilots were still lacking in combat experience, but they were not going to get that on the ground in England. On 27 January 1943, the 306th Bombardment Group took off from England in 64 bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, and they headed for the continent. The B-17 was capable of sustaining pretty heavy damage and yet still keep flying, and the B-24 was a long-range bomber that will eventually become considered adept at precision bombing missions. The anti-aircraft guns in and around Wilhelmshaven port could quite easily spot these American bombers in broad daylight. The American bombers came under intense anti-aircraft fire. The Americans lost 3 planes to German fire, and the crews on board those planes perished. The Luftwaffe lost a reported 22 planes when they engaged the US AAF fleet at Wilhelmshaven. Some of the source material suggests this number might be a generous estimate, but most sources say 22 Luftwaffe planes were shot down. Of the 64 American bombers that set out for Wilhelmshaven port, 53 made it to the objective and dropped over 137 tons of munitions, effectively damaging or destroying strategic naval construction facilities. Wilhelmshaven held several submarine bases. It was a relatively important seaport and will ultimately be attacked some 100 or so times throughout the entire length of World War II. The 8th Air Force was amazingly effective and accurate in bombing warehouses and factories in this first air attack against the Axis power. The raid set a precedent for American bombing efforts for the rest of the war, with US AAF bombers executing daytime precision strikes while their Royal Air Force counterparts carried out nighttime bombings. Quoted from a U.S. Army Center of Military History Facebook post. Up to this point in the war, the RAF had conducted all the raids that targeted Hitler's military assets inside Germany. The success of the US AAF in this Wilhelmshaven raid essentially marked the beginning of the US daytime bombing campaign. The 306th Bombardment Group has been inactivated, reactivated, and sort of rebranded with different names and missions in the last 80 years. But it does technically still exist as the 306th Flying Training Group. The 306th Flying Training Group is assigned to the 12th Flying Training Wing, which is under 19th Air Force at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas. Thank you for joining me today. The references included in the Twitter thread presented here are linked below in the description. If you are a fan of this content, please consider subscribing to my accounts on any or all platforms, as that helps me know the content is worth the effort. And stick around, this might be the best series yet.